Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to the 1000 Friends webinar for March. I'm going to share my screen because I have a slideshow all ready to go. I'm really excited that you are all here to join us today, and I know people are still trickling in, but we have a lot to cover, so we're going to get started. Couple of reminders before we really get going. Please make sure that your mic is muted in order that everybody can hear our presenters. We will have time for questions at the end. We're going to disable the chat at the beginning of the webinar, but we'll open it back up for questions when we're done with the presentation. As with all of our webinars, we'll send out a recording when we're done, and along with links with follow-up information and other resources. Special thanks to APA Wisconsin for approving this webinar for CM credits. So if you want that for your AICP, that link will be sent out afterwards as well. And I would also like to thank Godfrey & Kahn for sponsoring this and our entire webinar series this year. 1000 Friends of Wisconsin is an organization that's been around since 1996. We are dedicated to land use planning and transportation policy, and we work at the intersection of climate, health, and equity, looking through the lens of land use and transportation. So that's what we're about. My name is Susan Geddard. I'm the Community Programs Director here at 1000 Friends, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am joined today by Jenna Thomas from Bike Cleveland and Michael Kelly from BikeWalkKC. They will introduce themselves more fully when we get to their portion of the slideshow, but I want to welcome them and thank you for joining me because they have a lot of exciting stuff to share, and I'm looking forward to it. So we're here because there are all these changes that have been coming at us from the federal level since January 20, and the webinar today is not to talk about those changes or to discuss them in detail, but just to acknowledge that they are like part of the world we're living in now, and that it's been a lot to keep up with. And for those of us who work in transportation, either for local government or as advocates as we do, it's really quite distressing to see everything that's happening. I won't list them all here, but what we're seeing is like flashes to funding, reprioritizing of funding structures, and we're seeing like really critical information just disappear from websites, things like data sets that we use, guidance on safety and sustainability and equity. And this has never been easy work to begin with, but it's getting a lot harder. So it's creating a lot of concern and distress. And at the same time, I think it's reiterated the importance of really focusing on the work we can do and you know, where we do have like a little bit of influence and control. So this is kind of cliche to say think locally or think globally, act locally, but it really is coming to bear right now. So I am sort of buoyed by and encouraged by the philosophies around like thinking of hope as something that you can have every day alongside all of these other sort of feelings that you're working through, as well as knowing that, you know, working collectively, we can have more impact and more resilience. But what we do know in the face of all this uncertainty is that local relationships are more important than ever. We know that local influence can have a really big impact on people's lives and can help build that support. We absolutely know that we have a lot more power and resilience when we are working together. And for us at 1000 Friends, and from everything I know about Bike Cleveland and BikeWalkKC, the core of their work is really around diversity and equity and inclusion and accessibility. And even though those are very sort of charged words right at this moment, we also know that like safety and economic impact really are part of that. And those are things that resonate across the political spectrum. So with all of that, we're going to keep focusing on what we do best, and we're going to keep doing the work that we know the best how to do. So the webinar today is to show you some examples of what that actually looks like for us. So 1000 Friends, if you've met me in the last couple of years in any kind of professional capacity, you've probably heard me talk about this. But in case you're unfamiliar, the Community Transportation Academy is a program we started a couple of years ago, and it's really focused on that local level action, engagement, and education. So there's a graphic here on the right of the slide that's a illustration of a streetscape with a truck, a couple of trucks and a car and somebody in a wheelchair and somebody standing in a median waiting to get across the street. And it's really about how we're all part of that. So for the Academy, it's meant for community members who want to learn more about how transportation planning actually works in their own city or town. So it's a free course that we offer that's between 8 and 10 weeks long. We customize the curriculum for every location where we hold it. And it's really meant to help educate members of the public and help build capacity and engagement by sharing that knowledge and helping build some skills and helping people connect with each other and with their local experts and practitioners so that, community-wide there can be collective solutions to local transportation problems. The program started 2 years ago. In Wisconsin, we have held 4 academies so far, getting ready to do 2 more this year. And in 2024, we expanded across the Midwest to several other cities. All of them are continuing in 2025 with a couple more added. And our speakers today are from Kansas City, Missouri, Kansas sort of metro area, and Cleveland, Ohio. Those are the yellow stars you see on the map. So I will send these out in a PDF after if you want to have a closer look at the map. So the Academy curriculum has a lot of different components, but one of my favorite parts is that the very last class session, I turn it over to the participants so that they can present their own ideas for local solutions. So the prompt, the photo here is of the final class day in Stevens Point with a couple of students presenting to the class. And the prompt that I give to the Academy participants is just describe a local issue and propose a solution based on what you've learned in the 8 to 10 weeks, that we've been together. So everybody has between 5 or 7 minutes to present. We time it very carefully. And what they do is describe a problem, explain its implications, who's impacted by it, what will happen if nothing is done, and then propose a solution to that problem. So one of the reasons this is such a valuable part of the course is that participants have the ability to apply what they've learned and to present that information to other people. So their peers in the class, along with special guests that I've invited, usually city, county, MPO staff, elected leaders, other local leaders, basically people who have some kind of expertise or local influence or decision-making power so that they can hear what ideas people have. And since it's the last class, it's not a city council meeting, it's not where decisions are being made, it's a very friendly, low-stakes environment. And the good news is that we have actually seen some results from the Academy generally and from these final projects themselves. So speaking to this audience, I think you all will appreciate that the pace of infrastructure is pretty slow. So I can't tell you that we've seen major overhauls or community redesigns or huge policy changes as a direct result of the Academy program the last 2 years, but there have been some really small victories that can contribute to the larger picture. And I have 2 examples of that to show you today. The first one is from Stevens Point. So if you're not from Wisconsin, I have a little map for you. Stevens Point is right in the middle of the state. It's a small city of about 26,000, surrounded by rural area. It's on a river. And we held our second Academy there in fall 2023. So during the final class, there was a presentation by 2 gentlemen named Trevor and Rich, and it was about this elementary school that's in the north side of the city. You can see from the aerial photo that it's surrounded mostly by residential areas. So a large number of the students at this school are close enough to walk or bike there. But unfortunately, this property right next to the school where that yellow line is missing a sidewalk segment. So all the kids who need to go that way to or from school are forced out into the street right when they get to that property, which is right next door. So Trevor and Rich proposed on the last day of the Academy, this is very simple and straightforward, that the city install sidewalk on that property to complete the route so the kids wouldn't have to go in the street on their way to school. So that took place in early 2023. They presented to the other Academy participants. I had invited the mayor and the city council. There were some other advocates that showed up. The director of public works was there. That was really important. And the zoning administrator, who also participated in the academy, but serves as a liaison to the Bike Street Safety Commission. They were all there to hear this proposal. So as it happens, later that month, that November, there was a proposal. That proposal was submitted to the Bike Street Safety Commission. Public Works determined that it aligned with their timeline and their budget, and the director of Public Works was able to work it into a nearby reconstruction project. And less than a year after this thing was proposed, that sidewalk segment was complete. So I know it's just one piece of sidewalk in front of one person's house in one little city, but usually things don't happen that fast. And I think if you work in city government or in the advocacy space, you can appreciate how quickly that happened. But I want to point out that the academy is really and that final presentation was really the catalyst for getting it done. But there were a lot of other things that were in place that helped get it done so quickly and with so much support. And this is where I really want to point to that, the importance of those local relationships and that local influence. So first of all, the school's principal was very supportive. The community had been advocating for this for a while, but I think it was that presentation that got it off the ground. The property owner was very supportive. So the sort of bureaucratic hurdles were not really there for this project. There was excellent communication with city staff. The public works director was, very, very open to the idea and willing to be creative with where he fit it in. The zoning administrator, like I said, is an excellent communicator and just served as a great liaison between the community and the decision-making bodies that needed to make it happen. And then finally, in Stephen's point, there is like a long-standing tradition of advocacy for bicycle and pedestrian safety and street safety in general. Formally, their bicycle, pedestrian, street safety committee is part of their city governance structure. So that is highly considered in a lot of the projects that come through. And informally or unofficially, there's a really good advocacy base just citywide. So this is like top of people's minds. This is not something that seems to come out of the blue when people have these ideas. So before I move on from this, I just want to thank Trevor Rourke and Rich Sweet for presenting this and for following up with more information for me afterwards so that I could see what came of it. My second example is from La Crosse, Wisconsin, specifically about parking reform. And I just started with the punchline here on this slide. So in December, at the end of last year, the Common Council voted on this ordinance to repeal. They redid the zoning code to remove all off-street parking requirements. So this passed by a wide margin, a 6-3 vote. And I can't point to, there's not necessarily a direct line from the academy itself to parking reform in La Crosse, like I can point to in the last example, but it's got its fingerprints all over. The academy has its fingerprints all over this one, and there was much more public support, I think, and engagement than there would have been otherwise. So you can see, on this slide, Larry Sleznikov was one of the co-sponsors of this, and he was an academy participant in that program. So this photo here is of downtown La Crosse. You can see a bus going down the street. There's some old brick buildings, and there's a brand new bicycle track that was installed kind of on the right side of the road. So for those of you unfamiliar with La Crosse, Wisconsin, it is located on what we like to call the west coast of Wisconsin. It is flanked by the Mississippi River on the west and bluffs on the east. So it's kind of naturally built to be fairly dense and walkable, at least in the downtown core. And the timeline here, a lot of this information, by the way, I got from a staff report that was part of the public documents for the city council meeting. But the conversation around parking reform started as far back as 2018, when the Neighborhood Revitalization Commission began to talk about it. They commissioned a study a couple of years later, And then in 2022, the Common Council adopted new zoning code that eliminated parking minimums for commercial areas only. So that was a lot of setup and community support and precedent already. So in the meantime, we held our academy in early 2023. That was our inaugural one 2 years ago. 2 years ago this time, we were about halfway through. And in the meantime, the city had passed a new comprehensive plan. They adopted their first ever climate action plan, and they commissioned a housing needs study. So all those were documents that the new parking ordinance was consistent with. And then throughout this process, the names of people that I worked with in that academy in 2023 kept coming up. So there's a city council member, like I said. I want to give a big shout out to Jenna Dinkle, who prepared the staff report that gave me a lot of insight into all of this. She was a participant in that academy as well, and she was a new hire to city staff and does a lot of their bicycle pedestrian planning. So in addition to that, there was a lot of local support for this. And if you know anything about parking reform, even if it makes logical sense, and even if it's consistent with a lot of documents and local plans, getting the public on board is not really an easy task. Even if all you're doing is removing parking minimums, like there was nothing about removing parking itself. There was nothing about charging money for parking. There was nothing about setting parking maximums. So this was kind of like the first step to some of those other issues having to do with parking reform. I will say that a lot of this in La Crosse was framed around housing accessibility, because La Crosse, like most cities around the US, have a shortage of affordable housing. So this was meant as a first step to addressing that. But I read through all of the written public comments submitted for the city council meeting or common council meeting. There were over 24 of them, all in support, and many of them specifically called out the transportation needs of the city alongside housing and other issues. So I have a lot of quotes on here. I will not read them to you, but the first two are by Academy participants who were very engaged and involved the entire time. And they specifically call out transportation needs. And I just couldn't help but notice how present those were in many of the comments. The Common Council, their discussion itself, they talked about how engaged the community was and how supportive, and how that was unusual for a lot of the stuff that they talk about. So I don't want to take credit for that, having run, one academy with 30 people 2 years before, but I do think it contributed to the success of this and for this rolling through rather smoothly when you consider how controversial parking can be. Yeah. So I think that's it, what I've got for local examples. And I'm going to pass it over to Jenna Thomas.
Hello, my name is Jenna Thomas. I'm the advocacy director at Bike Cleveland in Ohio. On the slide, I've got our mission, which, we're a bicycle and pedestrian advocacy organization, really focusing on safe streets for all modes of transportation. I've been in this been with Bike Cleveland for my 3-year anniversary just came up, so 3 years. And last year was our first year hosting a community transportation academy. And prior to that, we were hosting something we called winning campaigns trainings, which came from People for Bikes, maybe, I believe. It was a curriculum that existed before, but I really just want to underscore that training is such an important part of advocacy and organizing, and it always has been. And if you're anything like Bike Cleveland, we have 5 paid staff members, which on it we have grown exponentially in the past few years. And for a long time, it was just 1 or 2 people. And if you're anything like us, you don't have a ton of capacity. So I think trying to use that capacity strategically, for us, that meant training our members and volunteers on how to do these things that we're doing, so we can have a greater impact. And so I'm going to share, if you want to go to the next slide, I'm going to share a little bit about just some of the sessions that we focused on for our Transportation Academy, and kind of why and what the outcome was. So our first session started with the history of transportation in Cleveland. And on the slide here, we've got two maps of a neighborhood in Cleveland called Tremont. The first one in 1951 and the other in 2015. And this was before and after highway expansion. And, you know, the map in 1951, this neighborhood butts up right against some industrial activity, but otherwise it was a densely you know, populated neighborhood, and there are people there. And after the highway expansion, like, you can see just parts of this neighborhood being decimated and just replaced. So with highways. And so this kind of first session kind of sets the you know, talks about the context that we're working with, talks about highway development, population and urban sprawl, and like how local government's approach to street design has changed over time, and like metrics they've used in the past to determine how they're going to design our roads, and, you know, things that could work better. And so we brought in a guest speaker for this, and many participants said it was one of their favorite sessions. And, you know, I think knowing the context that we're living in is very, definitely an important part of this work. Next slide. Another part of this training really focused on organizing 101. So we have an image here from our winning campaigns training, where some of our advocates gathered around a table planning a campaign to get our paratransit website updated, because it was just deeply not user-friendly. And this was a successful campaign that came out of our winning campaigns training. But I come from an organizing background of doing a lot of kind of campus organizing in college. And at that time, I was also doing a lot of trainings. And so we really focused on base building, like kind of knowing who your people are and what their role is, and, you know, to what level they're engaging in your work. One-to-ones and building relationships being a key, you know, a key aspect of this work. Yeah, I mean, relationships are everything, and making sure that your folks are like taking care of themselves and are doing the things that they want to do. Tactics, which I think Michael is going to be talking more about, but you know, how do we escalate our campaigns to build pressure and do that creatively? Making an ask was another lesson that we did, which, you know, it can be hard to ask people to do things sometimes. And so really getting back to the basics of organizing, and some of these are terms or concepts that like people are really familiar with, but maybe we haven't dug into and like talked about all of the inner workings of it and why we do what we do. And so that was a big focus of our academy. Next slide. We also did a decision maker panel where we had representatives from the city, county, and state. The image here is of that session. We had about 20 participants in the room with our three decision makers. And it's, you know, it's not super common that advocates are going to get an hour of like one-on-one time with, you know, the head of transportation at the county, the head of transportation at the city of Cleveland, and an ODOT representative. And so this was really just a time to like give everyone time to ask questions and try to get clearer on how these processes work. And this ultimately inspired a final project to push Cleveland City Council members to use discretionary funds on safe streets projects, just because like a lot of the students kind of came away with like, wow, this funding stuff takes forever, it's super complicated. Like, you're telling me that if I want this project to happen, I need to start now if I want it to happen, you know, in 2032. And so trying to figure out like what are the local levers for accessing funds to make projects move faster. Next slide. We also did a walk audit, and this was kind of approached as a train the trainer type of session, where we were really hoping people kind of came away from this ready to teach their neighbors, their block club, we have like chapters of Bike Cleveland, their chapter, how to do walk audits. And this was just a very practical thing for our students to come away with. On the right here, you have a screen cap of a walk audit tool that our own Michael Kelly designed, that I think is super great, although there's a bunch of resources out there. I'm working on making this one like more publicly accessible, and once I do, I'll share it with Susan. But you know, we just chose somewhere nearby that we could walk to, did a walk audit, and ultimately that inspired a final project that looked at vacant land usage and, you know, how can we reactivate some of the vacant land we were seeing. And finally, like, a lot of people wanted to keep learning and talking about these things and being in community with each other. So I've been doing about 2 online trainings a month, just on Zoom, open to the public. A lot of our students are coming, but a bunch of other people are as well. And I plan to continue this series monthly until our next academy. And this has just been a great experience overall, and I think definitely worth our time. And yeah, I think we've been really lucky to be able to develop this curriculum together, and it's been great. So that's it for me. We're going to pass it to Michael.
Thank you, Jenna, and thank you everyone for taking some time out of your day to listen and learn more about how each of us have used the Community Transportation Academy. So my portion of the presentation is really talking about setting participants up for success after the class. So Susan, we can jump to the next slide. I did want to start by giving a little bit of background about BikeWalkKC. So BikeWalkKC, we do work in the bi-state Kansas City region. For folks who aren't familiar, there is a Kansas City, Missouri and a Kansas City, Kansas. When you see the pictures of the skyline, that's typically KC Mo that you're seeing. But BikeWalkKC does work in both communities as well as the broader region. We also do work at the state and federal levels as well. And our basic idea is that you shouldn't need to drive in order to thrive, whether that be with economic opportunities, whether it be with medical appointments. You deserve to be able to get from one place to another as safely, as easily, as reliably as anyone else. And so we work to accomplish this really through 5 key program areas. Advocacy, which is my wheelhouse, advocating for the policies, plans, and projects that make it safer and easier for people to walk, bike, roll, and use public transit. Education, we have one of the largest Safe Routes to School programs of its kind in the country, where we teach children how to ride and walk safely. We also have a community planner on our staff who provides technical assistance to communities in everything from developing public surveys all the way up to writing and updating things like walkability plans. We also have a community dashboard where we're able to gather and share research around different aspects of transportation, access and mobility issues, around the region. And then the last thing with BikeWalkKC is we actually run the area's bike share program. So we're somewhat unique among bike ped advocacy organizations because those are usually 2 separate orgs. But for us and in our region, it makes a lot of sense for us to have bike share as part of our operating approach. So that's just a little bit about BikeWalkKC. Next slide.
Sorry, it is stuck. There we go.
All right, there we go.
I hope it doesn't skip to a whole bunch.
No problem. So kind of similar to what Jenna had discussed, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we have been able to use conversations with decision makers and power mapping to help people better understand how to use their voice to advocate for changes when it comes to our region's transportation system. Next slide. So I wanted to start by highlighting some of the key classes that we really feel are setting our participants up for doing the most after the class is over. So similar to what Jenna did in Cleveland, BikeWalkKC during our week 6 had a conversation with decision makers as part of a broader conversation about power mapping, which I'll talk about a little bit more here in a second. Week 7 was about selecting your campaign and tactics. So understanding that it's not enough to just say that you want to get something accomplished. You specifically need to know what sort of approach do you need to take in order to get that change to occur, to get that change to move from the paper to the pavement. And then the last one I wanted to highlight here was week 9. This was actually something where we asked our participants to tell us, what subject do you want us to talk about? And then we created a class based on their feedback. And so week 9 was all about accessibility and the future of transportation. And the reason I wanted to highlight this was because it really helps participants to begin to think about the different aspects that go into a course, but it also helps them to begin to think about, beyond everything that's being discussed in CTA, where else do I need to broaden my horizon, broaden my understanding to be a more effective advocate for the things that I want to see in my own neighborhood. Next slide. And so our panel discussion, so on the slide here, just remembering, want to be cognizant of the folks who may have vision challenges. On the left, there is a title panel, How Decision Makers Make Decisions. And then there are 3 bullet points with the names of the people who we invited for this panel. So the first bullet point is Councilman Eric Bunch from the 4th District of Kansas City, Missouri. The second bullet point is Alyssa Marcy, who is the long-range community planner for the unified government. And then the third is Representative Eric Woods from District 18 of the Missouri Legislature. And this is against a background of children crossing a street. So next slide. So I wanted to take a little bit of time talking through one of the activities that we did to help participants better understand how to think about aspects of advocating effectively to their decision makers. So what we see here is what is power mapping, figuring out who has influence. And what you see here is a green Post-it note with the word council member on it. So when we're talking about power mapping, this is the activity where we work to identify who a decision maker is, but then also who has influence around that decision maker. So we're starting at this point with the decision maker, and we're going to kind of slowly back out and see where are the places where we can potentially push and influence that council member to support what we're trying to get done. Next slide, Susan. Okay, so we've taken a step back, and in addition to the green Post-it note with the council member, we now have 4 additional Post-it notes that are blue. The one above the council member is their legislative aide. The one to my left is the staff. The one to my right is the other council members. And then the one directly below the council member Post-it note is the mayor. So when we think about power mapping, what we're doing here is we're specifically taking a look at who most immediately is likely influencing how a council member is thinking about a given issue. So a legislative aide is oftentimes someone who helps them think about this from the political side of things. They may talk with other council members, including from their own district or from their area of the city, to consider how is this going to impact our most immediate constituents. Same thing with the mayor. They may also talk to staff to get an insight on how much is this going to cost, or does this align with existing policies related to climate, transportation, equity, etc. Next slide. So we've taken another step back here. So in addition to the council member and the immediate blue ring of influence, we now have a pink ring of influence on top of this. And so I won't mention every single person that's on here, but I will highlight family and friends, the coffee shop, issue experts, business groups, labor groups, state leaders. So when we're thinking about how these all play into one another, there are not only people who influence the decision maker, there are also people who influence the influencers who then influence the decision maker. And so thinking about where all of these folks are, who all of these people are, and who specifically they are influencing can help you to get a better sense of who really has the decision maker's ear and who you could potentially have a connection with that would help you to more effectively advocate for what it is you're looking for. So if we're talking about a transportation decision, for example, talking with the coffee shop, they may benefit from having things like a protected bike lane in front of their business or sidewalks that promote more foot traffic. And so that may be something that could be used to influence how the council member thinks about the issue from a business standpoint. They could talk to other issue experts from sustainability or public health, who understand the connection between transportation and those issues, which then influences how staff is considering what legislation or what priorities the city has set and explaining this to the council member. So thinking about all of these things is a way for you to understand not only how a council member operates, but also what sort of arguments are going to be most persuasive in getting them to follow your stance. Next slide. So what we normally do with this, we break people into groups. And so we would break people into groups. We would ask someone to pick a real life decision maker. Third bullet point here is they would identify who the main influencers are. And then the final one is they would identify the secondary influencers. So similar to what I just described here, this is the activity that we would then break people out and have them actually do with their own council members, their own mayor, your board of aldermen, whoever it is that you see as a decision maker that needs to be influenced to support the issue you're trying to get it done. Next slide. So this last slide goes back to the original, just the green post-it note of the council member. It's titled Additional Thoughts on Power Mapping, and there are 3 bullet points here. First is that it needs to be adaptable to changes. Second, assess aspects of the map periodically. And third, a power map is still helpful after objective achieved. So talking about adaptability, you need to be able to understand that there are going to be changes in terms of who gains more influence with the decision maker and who loses influence over time. So being able to reflect that in your power map over time is really important to consider. Second is assessing aspects of the map periodically. So maybe a council member had to resign for health reasons or scandal, and there's now a new council member. Adding that in not only changes who you need to influence that council member, but it also throws off all of the other ways that that existing council member may have influenced the other people on the council that you need to convince. The final thing is a power map is still helpful after the objective has been achieved. So even after you've been able to get your main issue done, let's say that you were pushing for a crosswalk, you got the crosswalk installed. It is still helpful to have this information on hand because 9.5 times out of 10, when you're an advocate, it's never just one thing that you're pushing for. It's always one thing that's a stepping stone to something else. And having that information, that understanding of how a decision maker operates, who they rely upon to help them make those decisions is helpful not just with your most immediate issue, but with subsequent issues as well. Next slide. So the last thing that I wanted to really talk and spend some time about was advocacy beyond the CTA. So how alumni are moving forward. Next slide. So, jumped up a little bit. Okay, so we have a slide here where our participants are actually watching the decision maker panel. And then the slide is titled CTA Alumni Priorities. And there's 3 here: targeted project or priority, continued education, and greater civic engagement. So when we were working with our CTA folks during the course, we had an idea of some of the things we knew they wanted to do. But since the course has been over and we've been working with them to kind of track what they've been doing, we found that their priorities really fit into one of these 3 buckets that are listed here. So when we talk about targeted project or priority for the first bullet point, this is basically what we expected. So kind of what Susan talked about with Stevens Point and what Jenna talked about in Cleveland. There is someone who very specifically wants to get a crosswalk improved. They want to get a complete streets policy adopted. This is more or less what we expect and anticipate most CTA alumni to want to do. The second one was the most interesting. This was continued education. We've actually had 2 or 3 participants who have come to us and said, I want to take what this has taught me and use it to continue my own personal education. And I'll talk about one of those as well. The last one is greater civic engagement. So this is people specifically trying to either join an existing board or commission or seeing that one around that issue doesn't exist, working to develop one in their community on their own. Next slide. So in terms of the targeted project or priority, I'm going to talk about one of our alumni whose name is Dia. The 3 bullet points here: East Side Casey Mo. Second is wants safety improvements on 55th Street. And third is working through the budget process. So Dia lives on the east side of Casey Mo, which has historically been the underinvested urban renewal focused part of the city, unfortunately. And many of the efforts that went through here, including Highway 71, displaced thousands of predominantly Black residents. And so it also created streets that were dangerous by design in the process. So Dia lives along 55th Street. And so she specifically is living along one of the corridors that connects with Highway 71. And she unfortunately sees a lot of speeding and elements like that as a result. And so what she wanted to do was she wanted to use her opportunity to advocate for improvements. And I'll get to that question, Kathy, when we get to questions. But she wanted to see safety improvements along 55th Street. So one of the things that BikeWalkKC did was we informed her about the budget process. We said, this is one of the best ways to engage with this. And I will actually share a blog post here, but she recently went to the final public budget meeting and she spoke up for her neighbors. She spoke up for Vision Zero improvements, sidewalks, and transit. And if the budget is finalized with those elements included, it will largely be because people like Dia took that next step from the course and showed up to speak up for the things they care about. Next slide. Another person I wanted to talk about in terms of continued education was Kateri. So the 3 bullet points here are Northland wants to get a PSM in environmental assessment, and third, response from KU in January. So Kateri lives in the Northland of Casey Mo of the Kansas City area, which is a kind of, it is mostly made up of Kansas City, but it's also connected with various other communities in the northern counties, Clay and Platte. And so there's a very distinct set of transportation challenges that are different from those challenges south of the river. But even with that, Kateri was very much interested in participating in the CTA and learning more about environmental elements. And after she finished the class, she was so enamored with understanding these issues that she wanted to get a degree in it. So she wants to pursue a professional science master's with an emphasis in environmental assessment from the University of Kansas. So she reached out to BikeWalkKC and asked us to provide a letter of support for her application. And she found out in January that she was accepted. So Kateri will be starting her studies on her PSM later this year, and we are incredibly excited and thrilled for her to take that next step. Next slide. The last case study I wanted to highlight here was our CTA alumni, Dylan in North Kansas City. The 3 bullet points here are City of North Kansas City working to organize a BPAC and hoping to push later this year. So City of North Kansas City is a separate suburb from Kansas City, Missouri. Don't ask me why they didn't come up with a more unique name. It's just how they operate. But the community is quietly developed into one of the more progressive communities when it comes to walking and biking, evidenced by projects like Armor Road, Complete Streets, which you see here. With all that, though, Dylan realized after completing the course that North Kansas City does not have a BPAC or Bike Ped Advisory Committee. And so he has been working with BikeWalkKC to research what existing committees exist in North Kansas City, how they are organized, and who appoints the members of those boards and commissions. So taking all that information, he has been able to develop a proposal and begin shopping it around with the council members. And he is working to get it introduced as a formal legislative item later this year. When that happens, we have a very good feeling that it will be adopted. And so North Kansas City before the end of this year will likely have a brand spanking new Bike Ped Advisory Committee. And it's because of alumni like Dylan who are seeing the need and pushing for that change in their community. Next slide. So all this also supports BikeWalkKC's broader efforts. 3 bullet points here: building rapport with electeds and staff, keeping BikeWalkKC updated on key items, And third, mobilizing more people for active transportation. So in terms of building rapport with electeds and staff, one of the things that you will know if you've been an advocate for long enough is that it's really good if you're not the only person who's advocating for these changes. Like the electeds in Kansas City, they know me, they know when I show up what I'm talking about. And to an extent, like that's fine, but it's also really helpful when there are everyday residents who say, I live along the street or I live in this neighborhood and I want to see these sorts of improvements that are safe for me and my family. And so having people participate in the CTA and then go out and begin to advocate for these things means that they're able to build a rapport with their electeds, which makes those electeds much more sympathetic to the issue of active transportation and much more willing to work with them to help bring those ideas to reality. Second, it helps to keep BikeWalkKC updated on key items. Jenna talked about this earlier, but similarly, BikeWalkKC, we don't have eyes and ears everywhere. We just don't have the capacity to do it. We're in a 2-state, 9-county, over 100+ municipality region. It's hard to keep track of everything. And so having people who've gone through the CTA who can be our eyes and ears on these individual city councils and county commissions means that we have more antennas to sense when things are coming up, when there are more opportunities to speak up for these priorities. And then that in turn supports the third point, which is mobilizing more people for active transportation. It's really good when it's someone who is your neighbor or your coworker who is urging you to speak up for something, because again, it's my job, it's Jenna's job, it's Susan's job to advocate for these things. But it is oftentimes very impactful and very persuasive when it's someone that you know, when it's someone that you live with, you experience things with on a regular basis, who is also saying, hey man, this street is really unsafe. We should do something to advocate and ensure that it's going to be safer for ourselves and for our loved ones. So so the CTA is not only helping people to advocate more effectively for themselves, it is also helping BikeWalkKC to be a more effective organization with understanding what's going on, sensing what's coming down the pipe, and making sure that our members are mobilized and prepared to speak up for those improvements that we need to create safer streets for everyone. So next slide. That, I want to thank you all. And Susan, I will kick it back over to you. Really quickly, folks, I will drop a link in the chat to the update from Dia, who spoke up at the budget process.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Jenna. Like I said, we'll send out a recording of this, and it's got our emails too if you have questions. But for now, I'm going to stop sharing so that I can look at the chat and see what questions people have. So there's a question here from Kathy. I will just read it out loud. What suggestions do you have to work with, educate, or work around motor normativity among staff whose maybe outdated expertise electeds may rely on in deciding whether or not a requested change is feasible? For example, an engineer who says we can't put a bike lane there because there's not enough space, which turns out to mean street parking would have to be removed.
I can take that one first. So Kathy, what we've tended to find, and this was something that Jenna had alluded to earlier, is the best way to kind of break someone of their motor normativity is to get them out of their car and invite them to experience a community from the perspective of someone who walks or who bikes. And so in that way, we've often found that walk audits really are really effective means of helping to shake that motor normativity and get people to think more holistically about what sort of changes are needed to make the built environment safer. And so one example I'll allude to here is in KC-Mo a couple years back, we learned that that MoDOT was actually working to update a segment of highway that went through the east side that involved several crossings between the various neighborhoods there. but there hadn't been anyone who had actually gone out. They had been doing all of this analysis using Google Maps and online tools. And we said, no, bump that. You need to come out here and actually experience the built environment like everyday residents do. And that's largely walking. So we organized a walk audit, and it was of various crossings. We were able to show MoDOT staff, their consultants, and even some residents who didn't fully understand it, that it is terrifying, it is scary, it is dangerous to try to cross the existing bridges and other crossings along this highway. The report that we put together and the ongoing advocacy ultimately convinced MoDOT to update their plans to include shared use paths and dedicated sidewalks on almost all of the bridges that are going to be rebuilt over this segment now. So it is something that it can be difficult, but what we've often found is getting people to actually experience it from that pedestrian or cyclist perspective can be the best way to show why that infrastructure is needed.
I can throw out there too, you know, this held us back in Cleveland for a long time. And just late last year, the engineer that was holding everything up finally left. And all of a sudden things are rolling. But what we found is that like his opinions really just like seeped into all of the consulting engineers that the city works with, you know, his fellow like staff at the city. And so Bike Cleveland sponsored a like technical assistance training for all consulting engineers and city engineers on like how to build protected bike lanes, how to design for them specifically. And this was before he left, and I think he just kind of saw that the tides were turning, and he went to the state instead to block things up there. But that was one strategy that we used.
And full disclosure, I know Kathy, the person who asked that question. She's very involved. So I'm going to out you, Kathy. But I think, you know, it can be frustrating really working with very entrenched people. And, you know, like Jenna said, sometimes you kind of have to hope they leave. But I think that speaks to the power of collective action, really getting the community behind an idea. I mean, if you're having a real trouble with somebody who's just very, you know, is having trouble seeing outside the box, or, you know, coming into, you know, here we're almost in the second quarter of the 21st century when it comes to, you know, transportation design, even just encouraging them to try a temporary project and pointing to examples from other cities might get them to wiggle a little bit. I know that where I'm running this academy next in West Allis, they have a city engineer who's been very open to setting up like temporary curb bump outs with flexible bollards, which we know isn't as safe as an actual curb, but is a way to see how it will work and won't cost very much money, and to just give it a try. So anyway, that's something you can do. There's another comment here. Thanks so much for all of your efforts and advocacy, Susan, Michael, and Jenna. I have a request. Is it possible to start using walk, roll, audit as a title for this exercise to further include friends, neighbors that use wheelchairs, scooters, etc.? AARP hasn't gotten there yet. Yeah, they have a walk audit toolkit that they just call a walk audit toolkit, but I figured more people consider this if it will likely evolve. Thanks for considering. I think so, and I would agree. I have to confess, when I've run these in other academies, if we are not using wheelchairs, then I don't call it a walk roll audit because it's not actually a walk roll audit. So I think it's ideal if you can have, you know, at least one wheelchair or another piece of equipment that reflects that. But I agree. Yeah. That's important.
Yeah, I'll say that when we've done it, we've been fortunate. When we did the I-70 walk audit, we actually had a couple folks from the Whole Person, which is the local disability rights advocacy group, participate, including one person who used a motorized wheelchair. And there was another woman who lives with blindness and was using her seeing eye dog to participate as well. So yeah, I think even beyond changing the name is important, but I do agree with Susan that like acknowledging that if there isn't someone there who's actually using a wheelchair, then it can seem a little bit odd. One other thing I've seen too is there have been some instances where people will actually bring goggles that kind of inhibit your vision, and kind of walking sticks, so they can kind of simulate what it's like to be someone who lives with blindness or low vision, trying to navigate a certain portion of the built environment. So definitely good things to consider. And thank you for that suggestion, Trevor.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? Speak now, type now, or forever hold your peace.
Can folks raise their hands if they want, if they need a little
Yeah,
bit?
that's fine.
Yeah.
We don't have a huge number of people here. Might be that we just totally covered it.
I have a
Hi,
question.
Vanessa.
What's next? That's my question.
That for all of us?
For the academy.
Well, sure. I'll give an update just to everybody so you know. So as I showed early on in the slides, we have 2 more happening in Wisconsin this year. So one is in West Allis, which is a western suburb of Milwaukee. It's actually also home for the state fairgrounds, if you're not familiar. And then this fall will be in the greater Green Bay area, and I'm very excited to get both of those up and running. In the broader Midwest, we have academies in Cleveland again, Kansas City area again. Also, the Twin Cities is a repeat from last year. Oh, you put me on the spot. Detroit, Michigan. We are also adding Grand Rapids, Michigan, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Duluth, Minnesota. Did I leave anybody out? We had one in Des Moines last year, and I can't remember if they're repeating. So anyway, this whole, hi, Carrie. Carrie from Iowa is here. Are you repeating in Des Moines?
Yep.
Okay, so repeating in Des Moines and expanding to Cedar Rapids. So this idea is taking off. And you know, it'll be interesting to see where it goes. We are one of the big impetuses 2 years ago when I started this program was that at the time we were seeing this influx of federal funding available directly to communities to help implement more safety infrastructure and be a little more climate forward. To be totally frank, we're seeing a lot of that clawed back or rescinded or at least paused, right? So, you know, we're not seeing, like, we have different incentives now, right? We have different reasons to be really focused on local level action. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of these academies and what kinds of things people want to talk about. But I'm excited that it's going again. And I want to say also that for the locations where I've held these, I like to see where the advocacy is continuing and to see what kinds of things people are working on. Last year, I held one in Beloit, Wisconsin and Kenosha, Wisconsin, and I'm very curious to see what comes of that and what people act on, because it's just, those are very different places than where we started. So, and for me, it's a little different because I'm not based in any of the communities where I'm running these, unlike Jenna and Michael, who are very much embedded where they work. So maybe if you all want to say what's next for you, what you're looking forward to.
Yeah, I'll just say really quick that BikeWalkKC, we actually had a meeting yesterday to start trying to finalize all the information. We're gonna probably start opening up applications in April, and we'll kind of go from there. The other thing is I'm working with Vanessa to develop our CTA 201. So for the graduates of that initial CTA who want to kind of take that next step with their transportation advocacy skills, we'll be offering something for the graduates to be able to learn a little bit more who are really interested about that. So, yeah.
Yeah, very similar in Cleveland. Once we have a couple of cohorts under our belt, I think offering a 201 would be awesome. And in terms of mini academies, we've also thought about doing another like weekend long intensive training and then doing the cohort. So that's the plan.
And thank you for the reminder, Deb, in the chat. We're not, ready to talk a lot about it yet, but we are launching a mini version in Milwaukee this year, so please keep your eyes peeled for that. I've also been in discussions with a couple other people about the possibility of adapting this curriculum for other pressing issues, like around zoning, for example, or housing, or sustainability in rural areas. So there are a lot of ideas floating around there, and if anybody is interested, please contact me. I would love to talk more about it. I'm a giant nerd and I love education, so that's why I do this. I would also encourage any of you who wants to know what we are doing, what Bike Cleveland is doing, what BikeWalkKC is doing, to sign up for their newsletters. I will include links to all of that in the follow-up after this webinar, including our own newsletters. The one I write is for Active Wisconsin, and it comes out every month. So it is 1 o'clock, so we're gonna call it a day. Thank you all so much for being here. I hope you have a wonderful day and stay warm and dry.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.